Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorjan. I'm here with London Paul. And Paul, as we come to the end of the annual BRICS Summit, which started with a handshake and ended with a hug, we have to take a look at some of the things that really came out of this rather than all the hoopla and propaganda from either the mainstream media or the alternative media. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this great discussion. And what are your thoughts on what really came out of the annual conclave here in Kazan, Russia?
Well, yes, firstly, Ken, obviously, likewise, you joining me as ever. It's good that we get together. So, yeah, we thought it was interesting to pick up on some of the more important points. And I think the first point is to mention is the kind of indifference on the on the public level in the media, almost not mentioning the word BRICS and trying to sort of demean what was going on and almost pretend it's just Russia getting a bunch of friends together and having a chat, I mean, around a fire or something. So just very low key, but privately, this is rattled a lot of cages in the West. And even to some extent the United States, but particularly Europe, because Europe's looking at this going, well, we're already in serious trouble economically, financially, politically, we've got a huge problem, societally, where problems are building up. And suddenly there's this alliance of nations who look like they're all going to work together. And they're all very happy because we're not part of this organization, meaning we're not there dictating to them and telling them what they can do, can't do. And maybe we'd like to be part of this, well, but we can't be part of it because of our situation being the way it is, and as well as being a vassal state. But just there's a lot of grievances because of Europe's behavior and there's all the colonialism of the distant past, etc. And they're very frightened. And there was some sort of statements that are coming out. You're going, well, I think we might have to rethink our attitude and not be so condescending and patronizing and insulting to global South nations and actually treat them with respect, which is all they want ultimately, of course. So that's the first point. I think it's the first time the West has began to really realize what they're trying to do. And also that increasingly, there are large numbers of nations who want to join. And these nations are big vertical growth sectors in the future. They have a lot of resources that they can't exploit. And they just want a fair deal. They want to be represented in an equitable manner. They want to be able to have alternatives to Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. And they want to be able to exploit their resources without being exploited, basically. So that's the first point, and it's very clearly obvious that's come out of the back end of this. The US has said nothing, which for me is the biggest indicator that they're extremely nervous about this and realizing finally the world has had enough of US hegemony and it really wants to do its own thing and is making all the necessary strides forward to do this so they can maximize their own economies on an individual basis, a collective basis. And they'll need to do this via financing, and they're not prepared to be financed anymore by the predatory sharks, as I would like to call it, in the West. So then we get on to some of the points, but I'll stop there because just get your sort of brief feelings on this as well, Ken.
Yeah, the thing that I find interesting about the whole issue is take a look at what is the primary key thing that everybody is looking forward to, propagandizing about, speculating about. Of course, it's a BRICS currency, and they've been talking about this and promoting it and hoping for it, and who knows what agenda behind it, for a good year. But in reality, we see this interesting picture that popped up that everybody was getting exciting about, where one of the officials at the conference handed President Putin a facsimile of a what might be a BRICS currency bill. And he's holding it with two fingers. And I guarantee he's doing that on purpose for all the pictures to be taken and all the media to go wild about it. You know, if the West wants to think that there's going to be a new currency that's ready to be implemented, it's to the absolute benefit of the BRICS countries and the rest of the multipolar world, because then the United States, Europe, etc., are going to start doing certain things either to try to attack what isn't even actually, out there, and two, try to prepare for it by batting down the hatches. And I thought that was kind of cute and kind of interesting, and it was a political ploy, as well as letting the world know, yes, there is the intention of a BRICS payment system, but it's not going to be necessarily using a currency such as this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole issue of a common currency, it's clearly something that people thought was going to be announced at Kazan, but then they thought it was going to be announced at Johannesburg last year. And of course, this is just not reality. There's no basis in reality. Yes, there are a whole bunch of white papers in the possession of BRICS countries. It's all to be conducted privately behind closed doors, no public discussion about this, no decisions are being made. And rightly so, and we'll explain why in a minute. But with regards to these white papers, it doesn't mean any of them have been dismissed at this point, or any of them have been embraced as the future decision and how we're going to potentially roll out a common currency. So there was a lot of speculation, largely in the alt media, of course, and claims that a certain solution had been reached, and there was this broad agreement, which didn't make sense. And this is why it doesn't make sense. Because let's look at a common currency that's been an absolute abysmal failure, and that's the euro. And the reason it's been an abysmal failure is if you're going to have a common currency, one of the first things that has to happen is you have to have economic integration amongst the countries. You have to have some sort of reasonable level playing field between those economies. So how could Europe ever do that when you had Germany and Greece having the same currency as just in one example amongst many? It was doomed to fail from day one. Now we know the common currency of the euro was a political decision by the United States to try and control Europe, and was basically a prerequisite for Germany to have unification. You can't have unification if you don't ditch the Deutschmark and embrace this euro currency, and then we'll force the whole of Europe to adopt it also. So they have intelligently looked at this and gone, we are in no position currently to adopt any common currency. And there's an argument in some quarters for people to say it will never happen. There's no need to have it. And that might be true. But they've certainly said for the time being, it's not something we're considering, but we're considering it, but we're not going to roll it out. And we'll come on to why, apart from trying to achieve economic integration, because they know if you look at the BRICS countries, how do you marry up China with, say, in the future, Belarus? No disrespect to Belarus, but you get the point. It's all economies of scale. It's impossible. So how do you make this work in the future? Well, if you're going to have economic integration, then you're going to have to grow the economies of these countries and make it so it's feasible and viable to do so, if indeed, of course, you ever want to do that. So that's the main stumbling block in the future. The other stumbling block for a common currency is you need all the infrastructure put in place to support that so it can function as a common currency. And before we do any of that, and we've said this previously when we did a podcast on BRICS, that the initial intention is to get everybody bilaterally using local currencies, then multilaterally to put all the infrastructure in place to support those mechanisms. And when everyone's comfortable with those, and it's all working very smoothly and seamlessly, then you might be in a position, if at that point in time we have better economic integration or how it's going to work, then we can consider a common currency. But until that point in time, it's fraught with danger. I mean, what's the point in replicating the same nonsense the European Union came out with? It's pointless. So that's a really important point. We've covered a little bit of previous ground, but it's important to emphasize this because I can guarantee in a few weeks or months, there'll be a lot of statements made about how this common currency is coming out or some other common currency. And frankly, none of it's reality. And everyone needs to understand that so they don't waste the time being entertained by things that just have no basis in reality. Does it mean it won't happen in the future or will happen? It remains to be seen. If it's advantageous to do so, then they can do it. If it's not, then it won't happen. But it isn't an easy thing to implement because of the whole problem with economic integration. And if you have suddenly 35 very disparate economies in there, it becomes a huge challenge. And I think for the foreseeable future, it's not something that is a reality or can become a reality. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't in any way diminish what the BRICS wants to achieve. In fact, if you roll it out just for the sake of rolling it out, it will cause worse problems for those countries than it would have done even for the European Union. And that's saying something, as we know.
I think there's another important thing that came out of this conference is that no new members were upgraded. There was, certain partners that came in and they jostle around with some of their authority and responsibilities, but no new partners. Now take a look at what happened in the West. They have been rushing hand over fist to try to get into the EU or to get into NATO. Last year alone, Sweden, Finland, of course, Ukraine is trying to get in there and they're trying to dissuade. But it's like, and then of course, this NATO in the South Pacific region. The West is trying desperately to grab everyone under their vassal umbrella as fast as possible, while the BRICS are taking things methodically, making sure that nations not only are a good fit, but also are dedicated towards the principles of what the multipolar world is, rather than accepting someone because they see the short-term economic gains for joining the BRICS and the other, like the SCO or the ECN, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. So other points important is the role of the BRICS New Development Bank in terms of financing projects all across BRICS countries and other financing that can be in the public sector or even the private sector. Why is this important? Because this is a step towards saying we want to be self-sufficient and we don't want to be having to utilize the IMF and the World Bank, etc. in the future. So that was a big play on that. That's extremely important for the reasons I've stated. Another really important thing is this emphasis on developing economies and trying to, as you say, achieve more economic integration. Not necessarily anything to do with implementing a common currency, but by having economic integration, that benefits the collective, because it's all about the collective. Remember, yes, there are individual countries who want to be able to generate economic growth and prosperity themselves, but there's also an understanding if you're going to have these institutions, then everyone has to work for the benefit of the collective as well as the individuals. So there's huge amounts of work going on in that regard. And then we come on to what I think might arguably be the most interesting thing. No disrespect to the other things, they're all very important, but this stood out for me perhaps more than anything. And that was this commodities exchange where Russia suggested we need to have a grain exchange. Why? Because then they can deal with their own pricing. They're not subject to Western pricing. It allows them to start to have a major foothold in commodities markets. And if the BRICS gets big enough, and you extrapolate this to the global south, all of a sudden they have their own pricing mechanism and all the standards they want to introduce that benefits them collectively. So there was that, and you can obviously extrapolate that to whatever other commodities you want to include. The other important thing is there was talk about having a lot more energy cooperation amongst these countries. So could we potentially see a rival to OPEC in the future? And this would obviously relate to oil, but also you might have a gas exchange in place, because I mean, Russia is the biggest producer in the world. China is the biggest consumer in the world. It's just one example. And then, of course, there was mention to do with precious metals exchanges, where, I mean, that's an enormous statement in of itself, because clearly they're saying, well, and it wouldn't just be gold and silver, but let's focus on gold and silver. We want to have our own pricing mechanism. Now, of course, China already has that with the Shanghai Gold Exchange. Moscow is having its own gold exchange, and so are numerous other countries. But if we collectively have a big precious metals exchange where we can have buying and selling on the basis of physical markets, and we will be dictating the pricing of the market in an equitable way, then that's basically taking a huge stance against the West. And we know they want to do this. Well, that's just a great example. And of course, they phrase it in such a way to make it sound like it's not an aggressive move against the West. Aggressive is probably the wrong word, but it's saying we're going to create alternatives. The global South will adopt it, and this will be very damaging for price mechanisms in the West. And it's probably, as much as anything, why we're seeing quite a lot of institutions trying to make moves into the global South, because they realize the Western pricing system for commodities is going to diminish, particularly when these are going to be the countries collectively with all the resources. They're going to be the ones selling commodities in enormous quantities and buying in enormous quantities. So why shouldn't they have their own marketplace, whether it's precious metal, whether it's energy, whether it's grain and other agricultural products, which they've said they want to implement. So again, that gives them the ability to be self-sufficient in terms of pricing agricultural produce. And why not? Because there's countries there that produce huge amounts of food, etc. So again, gives them more food security, and collectively it will help to support the weaker nations who don't produce food and have to go out in the marketplace and get ripped off now, because the West has traditionally controlled these markets. So I think that's a hugely important point to make as well.
Exactly. And, by having this entire ecosystem of a community of partners, nations can then determine through communication in their region there what they are have shortages of. Say, like a Vietnam, it's not really an energy producer, but it's a manufacturing. It's a rice producer. So they know what they have excess of that they can ship, and they can coordinate with the best potential of the markets within the BRICS, within the SCO, the ASEAN, et cetera, to get what they need, while being able to provide to other nations that don't have the excesses that they do. And it can eliminate the potential of two competing markets fighting over each other, driving down prices, and really, for all intents and purposes, screwing each other over. If you're part of a conglomerate like that, or an organization, then rather than individual nations fighting each other with tariff wars, there'll be a coming together of everyone as a whole saying, hey, why don't you go ahead and, produce this more? Well, in the meantime, why don't you produce this? We will help you. And then, try to even out the commodities and the manufacturing, so that one nation doesn't gain an advantage over the other, which is something we see in the West, where sanctions, tariffs, everything it's all about protecting your own markets and your own sovereign economies rather than working as a whole. And I think that's one of the downsides of why, for all intents purposes, what Nord Stream 2 did is, whatever capacity the U.S. was involved in that, it was to get Russia or Europe off of cheap Russian energy and instead on higher priced U.S. LNG. You know, you're not going to see that with the BRICS nations, and that is going to me is going to be more important than whatever potential uh, currency platform that they come out of it. And if you think about it, the currency exchange has already taken place. CIPS, the SIP system for China, is already up to $17 trillion. That's not just China transacting with itself. That's China facilitating transactions between other BRICS, SCO, et cetera, nations using their platform.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the points to mention briefly, but the BRICS organization has multiple workloads, and I mean it's astronomical. And they work really hard, 365 days a year. And this is in terms of just not least putting some infrastructure in place. Are they going to put an alternative to SWIFT? Of course they are, but they're going to pretend it isn't, but it is. They're also going to look at trying to connect all the BRICS countries' financial markets together. So you need to put the infrastructure in place and to basically have the feasibility of an independent cross-border settlement depository infrastructure and mechanism. They need a clearinghouse, which they're looking at. They want independent reinsurance capacity as well. Everyone, of course, doesn't have to use this. Remember, it's a voluntary basis. This is a democracy. So the extent of the development of this is all these BRICS countries, you have the finance ministry of these countries, you have central bank governors who are going to look at all these issues in terms of accelerating the adoption of local currencies, payment instruments and platforms, and they're constantly feeding back in to whoever holds the rotating presidency, which is Brazil for the coming year. The other important thing is the BRICS contingent reserve arrangement. That's the CRA. That's to deal with short-term balance of payments pressures, strengthen financial stability. There's big work going on that basis, and they want this CRA mechanism improvement via alternative eligible currencies, and huge work's going on. They've had multiple different test runs of this, and they will continue to develop that facility because it's extremely important. The other thing is like partnerships for what they term this new industrial revolution. And, that is to get that framework in place, which will deal with the kind of challenges, opportunities, so all countries can rapidly evolve their industrial capacity and capability, and also to encourage industrial cooperation between the countries. And this is in multiple areas. In industrial terms, you've got mining capacity, metals, chemical industries, digital transformation. There's all the small, medium enterprise. That's a big thing across the global south. It's not all about big corporations. There's all to do with intelligent manufacturing, robotics. There's all to do with medical services, big pharma, or the lack of big pharma, photovoltaic industry. The list is endless, and they're going to work extremely hard to put that platform in place to benefit all the countries. And that's just a small proportion of all the things that will be going on. I don't know how many work streams there are. There's probably dozens of them. And there's huge amounts of work going on. And these countries aren't getting someone to sit there like they do in the West and get paid £500,000, euros, dollars a year for doing nothing. These people are actually working extremely hard to bring all this together and to give this some structure. And then the ultimate question is, and we're not in position to answer that this time, when does this become like a fully fledged legal entity? When does it have a charter? When does it have articles of association, etc., etc.? There's talk about that. That probably is going to come at some point in the future. But at the moment, there's no need to do that. So when anyone goes on about they're not doing anything, nothing's happening, just bear in mind, as Can made, we were discussing this before we came on air, the origins of Bretton Woods started, as you said, Ken, at the end of World War One, and it took basically till the 1950s for it to realize what it was intended to do. Originally, when of course it actually worked until they went off the gold standard, and then the whole thing fell apart. But the point is, it takes a long time, and therefore you can't expect these kind of institutions to just roll up one day and go, here's a common currency and we're all going to use it, because it's just not feasible. And frankly, for people to suggest that really suggests to me they don't understand how a future alternative financial system works, how a common currency works. This is just sounds very entertaining and intriguing, but there's no basis in reality. And the problem is, it encourages people to have false optimism. And then when things don't happen, they think nothing's happening and they lose interest. And fortunately, the people running the BRICS institution or BRICS Alliance and all these work groups and all the presidents, prime ministers, governments, finance ministries, central bank governors who are all involved, at least they understand the undertaking and they're not taking their foot off the accelerator, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be interesting, and I think the benefit that they have is they have more than a century of seeing how things that worked within Bretton Woods and within the Euro system, the EU, and look at things that didn't work and try to avoid the pitfalls that really have brought down or lead to corruption in the Western systems. Paul, I think we got quite a bit covered.
Sure.
Fascinating BRICS conference, and this is just an annual conclave. What goes on in the BRICS happens year round, so we'll keep you updated on anything that does come in the future. Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this discussion.
Yeah, and likewise, of course.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for being a part as well. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.